This is an umbrella for the start of Brollys.
Rainbows climb, clouds drift by, Brollys fly through a magic sky. Is this real? Are they dreams? Nothing appears to be what it seems. Then far away I can hear a voice in the weather house call out a name. Mr. Brolly, it's time for the rain.
Harry was trying to go to sleep, but no sooner had he closed his eyes than he opened them again. Tucked up beside Harry in bed were his toys, Elephant and Hippo. Snake, as always, lay on the rug by the door, and Bird was perched on the chest of drawers. Harry stared down at his patchwork quilt. It was different from other quilts. Instead of flowery scraps of material, it was made of little embroidered pictures of rainbows, stars and planets, clouds, and great flashes of lightning in a dark and stormy sky. It had been made a long, long time ago. On the wall hung Harry's weather house. If the day was going to be fine and sunny, Mrs. Brolly came to her door. If the day was going to be wet and cloudy, Mr. Brolly came out. But of course, they never came out together, for it is impossible for a day to be both wet and dry at the same time. But what would happen if they both came out together? Wondered Harry, and he sat up and stared at the weather house. As he stared, the doors seemed to grow larger. His bed grew smaller, and he found himself at the entrance of the weather house. A light was shining from the door, through which Harry could see Mr. Brolly no longer fixed to his wooden stand, but moving freely about the room. As Harry entered the weather house, he saw Mr. Brolly doing nothing whatsoever but standing by his workbench and smiling beneath the brim of his hat. "I'm conjuring up the spring, my boy," he said. "Any moment now it will arrive in one glorious burst of flowers, birds and bees. One," he said. "Two," he went on, opening an eye and smiling at Harry. "Three." A single flower in a pot suddenly appeared on Mr. Brolly's workbench. It was a very timid-looking little flower, and it hid amongst its leaves like someone who has been awakened too early and who wishes nothing more than to be allowed to snuggle back under their bedclothes. Mr. Brolly picked up the pot plant and looked at it. "And where are the rest of you, eh?" he said. The little flower hung its head. "Please, sir," it said, "they're still asleep, sir. There's only me, sir." It was exactly like a small schoolboy being questioned by a teacher. "You were supposed to be a glorious bunch of blooms, Wilkins," said Mr. Brolly. "However, since there's only you, we must do our best." "Wilkins?" said Harry. "You can't have a flower called Wilkins." At this, both Wilkins and Mr. Brolly turned their heads and looked at him. Harry laughed, for this was one of the nicest things about the weather house, the way that silly and absurd things became quite ordinary, like there being flowers who could speak and who answered to the name of Wilkins. "Come along," said Mr. Brolly. "Wilkins here is going to impersonate a whole bunch of flowers, aren't you, Wilkins? A token of spring to give to Mrs. Brolly." "But it isn't spring, Mr. Brolly," said Harry. "Look." Outside, the garden showed a bleak and icy scene. "My boy," said Mr. Brolly, "this sort of thing will go on forever if one lets it. One must take matters into one's own hands. Help me conjure up the spring." Harry closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he found that he was holding a small rainbow. Mr. Brolly looked at it in silence for a moment. "Well, you tried, my boy," he said, "and that's what matters. It's not the biggest rainbow I've ever seen. It certainly isn't the brightest, but it is a sign of hope." "But, Mr. Brolly," said Harry, "I didn't try. It was just suddenly there." "Well, that's what I like about spring," said Mr. Brolly. "The suddenness of everything. Suddenly there's sunshine. Suddenly there's rain. Suddenly there's a rainbow. And suddenly," he went on, as his hat began to bob up and down on his head, "there's a thundercloud under one's hat." He tried to look pleased about this. "Oh, the silliness of spring," he said, holding on to the brim of his hat. "Leaping lambs, mad March hares." But it was as if his hat had a light of its own. Thunder rolled. Lightning flashed. At last, Mr. Brolly took his hat off. The small black thundercloud sat on his head for a moment, as if wondering what to do. Then it began to roll about the room, looking for the best place in which to have a really good thunderstorm. Being newly made, it found the whole thing very exciting, and it made a great deal of noise, considering what a very small cloud it was. "Blip," it said. "Blop." Mr. Brolly seemed not at all surprised by this. "I'm afraid he's not quite the thing," he said to Harry in a whisper. "He certainly isn't a proper thundercloud." At this, the little thundercloud hurtled across the room, knocked Mr. Brolly's hat to the ground, and threw a small thunderbolt inside. "Blip," it said, and made off to the kitchen with all speed, where Mrs. Brolly was sleeping in her chair. The little thundercloud bounced into Mrs. Brolly's lap and lay there quietly for a moment. "Blippy," it said hopefully. When Mrs. Brolly didn't wake, it drifted up to her shoulder and murmured, "Bloop," softly in her ear. Then it hovered over her head and rained down on her as hard as it could. Mrs. Brolly awoke with a start